The morning air carried the sterile chill of glass and steel towers when Maya adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag and walked into Wellington & Co., the law firm where the air itself seemed to sneer at her presence, as though its marble floors and vaulted ceilings had been designed to intimidate anyone who didn't arrive draped in privilege. Heads turned when she entered, not with admiration, but with a subtle, collective tightening of jaws. A flicker of disdain behind designer spectacles. The unspoken reminder that she was the diversity hire, the one whose presence ticked a corporate box rather than represented true belonging. And in that silent battlefield of smirks and whispers, Jacob Wellington, the firm's heir and her senior partner, always made sure to sharpen the knife of humiliation with surgical precision. Every meeting became his stage. Every coffee spill or misplaced document a performance in which he reduced her into a spectacle of inadequacy, and while others laughed or looked away, Maya absorbed the cruelty with a face carved from stone, her silence not weakness but survival. Because inside her the fire burned differently, a quiet, dangerous flame that marked the difference between the girl they thought they could crush and the woman she was becoming. Still, the weight pressed heavy. Every day was a gauntlet of coded insults, backhanded compliments, and the careful orchestration of failure. Like the morning when she stood in front of the boardroom, carefully arranging the slides of her presentation only to feel the sudden shock of scalding coffee cascade over her blouse. Jacob's clumsy hand the culprit, his lips curling in an almost imperceptible smirk as executives chuckled and whispered, "Watch where you belong," under their breath. Her papers ruined. Her skin burning not only from the liquid, but from the humiliation deliberately engineered to remind her that she was not welcome here. She gathered her pages, damp and ruined, and though her hands trembled, her voice did not crack when she said, "This will not stop me." Words spoken softly enough to sound like surrender, but loaded with a promise Jacob failed to catch. Because men like him never believed women like her carried more than endurance. They never believed someone who wasn't born into marble hallways could rise to own them. But what he didn't know was that Maya's silence was a mask. A strategy, the way she mapped his every move, memorized his manipulations, learned the rhythm of his cruelty like a soldier studying the battlefield, preparing for the moment when one misstep from him would open a door for her to not only fight back, but to win. Yet in this chapter of her life, winning was not yet visible. Only the grinding humiliation of proving herself 10 times harder than anyone else in the room. The long nights when she studied case files under the flicker of cheap apartment light, while her colleagues sipped wine in penthouses bought by their father's connections. The constant reminder that every word she spoke carried not just her reputation, but the weight of every stereotype waiting to crush her if she faltered. And still she endured, not out of stubbornness, but out of necessity. Because walking away would mean validating Jacob's every sneer, every whisper that she didn't belong. And so each day she returned, polished and precise, masking the bruises of insults beneath pressed blouses and meticulous notes. Each step forward an act of rebellion. Each breath in that office an act of war disguised as compliance. And as Jacob strutted through the halls, his arrogance growing fat on unchecked cruelty, Maya kept her eyes forward, her mind sharper than her silence suggested. And though the world saw her as the victim in waiting, she was already writing her opening argument. One that would not only dismantle Jacob's empire of entitlement, but shift the ground beneath every sneer in that building. Though for now, in this beginning, she played her part. The underestimated, the humiliated, the quiet, because every revolution begins in silence. And hers was just waiting for the right moment to erupt. The weeks that followed blurred into a relentless cycle of sharpened insults and meticulously crafted sabotage. Jacob weaving traps with the ease of a man who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. The kind of man whose last name opened doors before his intellect ever could, and Maya, the target of his games, walked through those same doors every morning armed with nothing but the weight of her competence and the patience of someone who had been underestimated since birth. Her quiet endurance mistaken by Jacob for fragility, her silence interpreted as defeat, when in truth it was calculation. Because each humiliation he delivered was not only absorbed, but catalogued, stored in her mind like pieces of evidence waiting for trial. Still, survival was not passive. It came at a cost. The nights stretching longer as she pored over legal briefs until her eyes burned. the clock ticking past midnight while her colleagues celebrated victories built on foundations she had quietly laid. And yet the applause always went to others, never her, because Jacob made sure of it, redirecting credit with a sly word, framing her as a background player in victories she had architected. And when the partners nodded in approval of his brilliance, he would glance at her with a smirk that said, "See how invisible you are?" But invisibility, she knew, could be a weapon for what they could not see, they could not prepare for. The rising tension reached its first fever pitch during a high-profile corporate fraud case. One Jacob insisted on leading, though it was Maya who discovered the thread that unraveled the defense. Her late nights tracing financial records no one else bothered to examine. And when she presented the discovery to Jacob, his eyes gleamed with the kind of cold satisfaction only predators know, because he saw not the brilliance of her work, but the opportunity to steal it, to wear her intellect as his own armor. And in the courtroom he did just that, standing tall, performing with dramatic flair, while Maya sat at his side, the silent shadow, the woman who had unearthed the truth but would never be acknowledged for it. And though the judge's gavel fell in Jacob's favor, and the firm celebrated his genius, Maya sat in her apartment that night with the echo of the gavel still ringing in her ears, not as a symbol of his victory, but as a promise of her own future reckoning, because she knew that every case, every stolen idea, every laugh at her expense was not only building Jacob's arrogance, but also laying the groundwork for his downfall, a downfall that would come not from loud declarations, but from the very precision he mocked in her, and still the pressure grew heavier. Jacob began escalating, his cruelty no longer confined to subtle sabotage, but bleeding into public scenes meant to shatter her composure. Like the morning he accidentally knocked her files across the courtroom floor before a packed audience, the papers scattering like feathers while he smiled apologetically to the judge, as if her humiliation were a joke everyone was in on. And yet when Maya bent to gather the papers, her hands steady, her eyes unwavering, she whispered to herself words no one else could hear. Patience, Maya. Patience. Because what Jacob failed to realize was that he was training her, every cruelty sharpening her into steel, every act of malice teaching her how to navigate a battlefield designed for her failure. And though the weight of isolation pressed down on her, though whispers about her incompetence crept through the firm like poison, she held fast. Her silence not surrender, but strategy. Her every late night at the office a rehearsal for the day she would stand not as the silent shadow, but as the voice that shattered the glass ceiling above her. Yet the cracks were forming already, invisible to Jacob but felt deeply by Maya, because with every humiliation, every theft of credit, every calculated trap, he was pushing her closer not to collapse but to ignition, and though he still strutted through marble hallways as though he owned the air itself, Maya carried within her a gathering storm, one that would soon tear through the carefully crafted illusions of power Jacob wrapped himself in. And when it came, it would not just be revenge, it would be justice, the kind that rewrites stories and topples empires. Though for now the tension simmered, unspoken, invisible, but alive, growing stronger with every calculated cruelty. The day of the breaking point arrived draped not in ceremony, but in the oppressive stillness of inevitability. The kind of morning where the city's hum seemed muted, as if the air itself was holding its breath, and Maya felt it in her bones when she stepped into the courthouse. Files pressed against her chest like a shield, the echo of her heels against the marble floor reverberating louder than usual, though perhaps it was not the sound but the weight of what she carried, years of humiliation, years of silence, years of being underestimated, now condensed into this single day, this single case. The one Jacob had built his entire performance around, the one he believed would finally cement his place as a legend within Wellington & Co., because he had stolen yet again from Maya, twisting her strategy into his own grand narrative, parading it before the partners as though his brilliance had conjured it from thin air. And the room was packed with journalists, clients, and onlookers, every eye on Jacob as he strutted forward, confident, rehearsed, his suit sharp, his smirk sharper, the predator stepping into his arena. Maya, as always, sat just behind him at the plaintiff's table, the shadow he dragged with him, the figure everyone overlooked. But this time, she was not here to remain invisible. This time, she was not here to simply endure. Because what Jacob didn't know was that she had prepared more than notes. More than arguments, she had prepared the truth. And she had chosen today, this very public battlefield, as the moment to unleash it. The trial began, Jacob's voice booming as he spoke to the jury, weaving a tale of corruption, fraud, and moral decay in the opposition. His gestures dramatic, his pauses perfectly timed, his eyes flicking toward Maya now and then with that familiar glint of mockery, as though daring her to interrupt, daring her to reveal her insignificance in the shadow of his charisma. And the room drank it in, the jury nodding, the spectators whispering, the partners in the back row exchanging approving looks. But Maya's gaze never wavered, her hands folded, her breath steady, her mind sharp as a blade waiting to strike. And when the judge turned to her, inviting the junior counsel to speak, a ripple of surprise moved through the room because Jacob hadn't expected her to take the floor at all. After all, she was the assistant, the afterthought, the paper pusher. But Maya rose slowly, her presence quiet yet commanding, her voice even, clear. And in that instant the room shifted, not loudly, not obviously, but subtly, as though everyone had leaned in without realizing. Drawn by something they couldn't yet name, she began not with accusations, but with facts, methodical, undeniable, laying out the financial patterns she alone had discovered, her arguments crisp and devastating in their precision. And the defense faltered, visibly shaken, their carefully crafted lies unraveling under the weight of Maya's evidence. But it was when she paused, when she turned her gaze not to the defense, but to Jacob himself, that the temperature in the courtroom truly shifted, because instead of continuing her dismantling of the opposition, she pivoted, her words deliberate, cutting through the silence. And yet, Your Honor, what's most troubling is not just the fraud committed by the defendants, but the fraud within this very firm, a fraud that steals voices, buries truth, and parades stolen brilliance as its own. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaning forward, Jacob stiffening, his mask cracking for the first time as Maya continued. Her voice steady, her eyes locked on his. For months, strategies have been lifted, evidence ignored, work stolen, not by mistake, not by accident, but by design, and today, I will not allow my silence to protect that deceit any longer. The words landed like thunder, electrifying the room, the jurors wide-eyed, the spectators whispering, the partners frozen in disbelief. And Jacob, scrambling to recover, interjected with a laugh too forced to be convincing, muttering about emotional outbursts and irrelevant grievances. But Maya was relentless, sliding documents across the table, emails, drafts, time-stamped notes. All the proof that every idea Jacob had paraded as his own had originated from her fingerprints on every discovery, her signature on every trail of brilliance he had repackaged. And the judge, eyebrows arched, demanded silence as the evidence was reviewed, the weight of it undeniable. The defense forgotten as the spotlight turned on Jacob, his smirk gone, his carefully constructed image collapsing in real time. And for the first time in years, Maya saw fear flicker in his eyes. Not the fear of losing a case, but the fear of being unmasked, stripped bare before the very world that had fed his arrogance. The courtroom buzzed. Reporters scribbling furiously, cameras clicking, whispers of fraud and exposed darting through the gallery. And Maya, standing tall, felt the years of silence shatter inside her. Her voice no longer quiet, no longer calculated, but powerful, resonant, unstoppable, carrying not just her truth, but the truth of every woman, every outsider, every underestimated soul who had ever been told to stay silent. And when she finished, when she placed her final piece of evidence before the court, the silence that followed was deafening. The kind of silence that signals not absence but transformation. And though the judge had yet to rule, though the jury had yet to deliberate, the outcome was already written in the crackling air of that courtroom. Jacob Wellington had been broken, his empire of entitlement collapsing under the weight of the very shadow he had tried to erase. And Maya, standing in that storm of shock and revelation, knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed the courtroom eruption were less like a continuation of trial and more like an earthquake's aftershocks. Tremors spreading far beyond the courthouse walls into streets, offices, television screens, and dinner tables across the city. Each headline screaming about the downfall of Jacob Wellington. each broadcast replaying the exact moment Maya's calm voice had sliced through his empire of arrogance like a blade. And yet victory was not clean, not immediate. Because with Jacob's empire collapsing came a storm of resistance. His allies scrambling to protect their own names. His family leveraging their influence to discredit Maya. Tabloids painting her as opportunistic. Whispers of ungrateful, angry, too ambitious, swirling like toxic smoke in boardrooms and online threads. Because the world never allows a woman, especially a woman like Maya, to rise without punishment. And though supporters marched outside the courthouse with signs reading, "Justice for Maya, Truth over Power, and End the Old Guard," there were just as many voices shouting from the shadows, clinging to Jacob's myth, desperate to preserve the illusion that privilege was earned rather than inherited. And it wore on her, the way every interview request framed her as a symbol rather than a person, the way strangers dissected her past, digging through her schooling, her neighborhood, her family, searching for cracks to exploit, because tearing her down was easier for them than admitting the structures they worshipped were rotting. And still Jacob, even from the ruins of his reputation, fought to cast his shadow over her, his lawyers filing appeals, his allies staging press conferences to insist this was nothing but a smear campaign by a bitter junior associate, their words dripping with condescension, painting her as hysterical, desperate, disloyal. The firm itself, fractured, half the partners scrambling to distance themselves from him, while the other half whispered in corridors about betrayal, about loyalty, about how Maya had gone too far. And within that fracture, Maya walked a razor's edge, balancing the weight of vindication with the burden of survival. Because though she had revealed the truth does not guarantee safety, it guarantees war, and she could feel it in the stares when she entered the office, could hear it in the hush of conversations that silenced when she passed, could sense it in the emails that now excluded her from meetings she had once prepared. And though the public saw her as triumphant, as the woman who had toppled a giant, she felt more hunted than ever, Jacob's shadow stretching from every dark corner, reminding her that even in disgrace, privilege does not vanish, it fights, it clings, it poisons. But she did not break, because with every protester holding her name on a sign, with every message from a young woman saying, "You gave me courage," with every headline that dared to ask if the age of Jacob Wellingtons was finally over, she found fuel, not comfort, but fire, the kind of fire that grows in the cracks of concrete. Stubborn, defiant, unstoppable, and as Jacob sat in the cold light of his cell, his empire reduced to ashes and lawsuits, his arrogance corroded by fear, he still plotted, still whispered through allies who tried to smear her name. But Maya understood now what she had not fully grasped before, that this was never just about one man, never just about Jacob Wellington, but about every system that had allowed him to rise, every silence that had protected him, every sneer that had gone unchallenged, and by breaking him, she had cracked something larger, something older, something woven into the marble halls themselves. And though that meant her war was far from over, though that meant she would never again know peace in anonymity, she carried it shoulders straight, voice steady, eyes unflinching, because she had walked through humiliation and fire and come out steel. And no shadow, not even Jacob's, could dim that transformation. So when the appeals came, when his allies screamed on television, when the firm itself trembled under lawsuits and scandal, Maya stood, not as a victim, not as a token, but as a force. And the city, the nation, even the world, watched, some in awe, some in fury, but all unable to look away, because they had seen what happens when the underestimated finally rise. And they knew this storm was only the beginning. The resolution did not arrive as a single gavel strike or a triumphant headline, but as a slow, grinding transformation, a shifting of tides that began quietly and then roared, until even the marble towers that once sneered at Maya had no choice but to acknowledge her. Because Jacob Wellington, once untouchable, once the golden heir of privilege, was now a name whispered with contempt, his trial ending in a guilty verdict that not only sentenced him to years behind bars, but shattered the illusion that his bloodline could shield him forever. The courtroom packed with journalists capturing the moment when the judge declared him guilty of fraud, misconduct, and perjury. His once flawless suit now clinging to a body that looked smaller, diminished, the arrogance stripped away until all that remained was the hollow echo of entitlement. And though the world cheered, though cameras flashed, though protesters outside erupted into chants of justice, Maya did not celebrate with fireworks or champagne, because for her, this was never about one man's downfall, but about rewriting the narrative that had once chained her. Still, she stood outside the courthouse that day, the cool wind brushing against her face as microphones swarmed, voices demanding a statement. And she spoke not with anger, not with the venom Jacob had poured into her life, but with calm clarity, her words carrying like steel wrapped in silk. This victory is not mine alone. It belongs to every person who has ever been silenced, dismissed, or erased. It belongs to those who endure not because they are weak, but because they are strong enough to wait for the right moment to rise. Let today be the beginning, not the end. The footage spread across the world, replayed on every channel, quoted in every paper, her words sparking debate, inspiring movements, igniting conversations in places that had long buried them. And within weeks, panels on systemic abuse of power were being held. Reforms in corporate governance drafted, the ripple of her defiance reaching places even she hadn't imagined. And while Jacob rotted in a cell, his name spat out as shorthand for corruption and cruelty, Maya's name began to climb. Not as a token, not as a footnote, but as a leader. Invitations flooding her inbox, universities asking her to speak. Advocacy groups begging her to lend her voice. Firms offering her positions of power, but she chose carefully, refusing to be used as decoration, refusing to let her legacy be co-opted by the very systems she had fought against. And instead she founded her own firm, a place built not on nepotism or inherited privilege, but on merit, justice, and integrity. Its glass doors open not only to the elite but to the overlooked, the underestimated, the ones who carried fire in their silence just as she once had. And slowly, steadily, it grew, her courtroom victories piling up, her reputation cemented not only in law but in the cultural memory of a generation. And yet through it all she carried humility, remembering the sting of spilled coffee on her blouse, the weight of laughter at her expense, the burn of humiliation that had once threatened to break her, but instead forged her into steel. In interviews, she never softened the truth, never pretended it had been easy, instead telling the world that power never concedes without a fight, that justice is not given but taken, that silence is not weakness but preparation, and her words carved into the bones of those who listened. A new kind of gospel for the underestimated. Jacob's shadow, once looming so large, faded into obscurity, his appeals denied, his allies abandoning him, his empire dismantled brick by brick until the Wellington name no longer commanded awe but evoked disgust. And in that fall lay the full circle of Maya's journey, not revenge, not petty triumph but balance, justice restored, the narrative rewritten, the victim turned victor not by luck or mercy but by unyielding resilience. And so, as the years passed, as her name etched itself into history, Maya became more than just the woman who had destroyed Jacob Wellington. She became a symbol of what it means to endure, to fight, to rise. Her story told in classrooms, in boardrooms, in whispered encouragements from mentors to their protégés, a living reminder that underestimation is the sharpest blade, because it blinds the powerful to the storm brewing right beneath their feet. And when the storm breaks, it does not merely wound, it transforms the world.